Hi everyone! Thanks for visiting my channel. If you're new here, welcome. I'm Carol, the Thrifty Chic Housewife. If you enjoy the content you find here, please consider subscribing, like and share my videos, and follow me on social media. I will leave all the links in the description box for you below. So I hope this video finds you all safe and well. Got a lot of crazy things going on, but today is kind of a gloomy day outside and my shelves are depleted of French onion soup. Thought I'd bring you along while I make and then can up some delicious French onion soup. French onion soup is so great to have on your shelf. It's perfect straight out of the jar. Just heat it up, toast you up a piece of a nice baguette with some ooey gooey cheese on top. You have a delicious bowl of soup, but it's also great as a base for gravy. It's also great as a meal starter. Just cook some rice in with it, add you some meat. You can use chicken, you can use beef, you can use whatever you want, add some meat, and then you have a beautiful meat and rice dish that's deliciously seasoned. Sprinkle some cheese on top, complete meal, super simple. So there are a million different ways to use it. I make French onion pork chops with it, and I'll try to link some of these recipes I'm talking about for you below, and maybe even do an iCard for you. I have French onion pork chops on my channel, and you could completely skip the first steps of making that. The soup is just ready to go. You just have to cook your pork chops and then thicken it a little bit and you're good to go. The caramelized onion gravy with the Salisbury steak that I made for a romantic dinner for two. This would be a great starter for that as well. So there are tons of ways to use it, and it's just fabulous to have on your shelf. So that's what we're going to be doing today. We are going to be using the basic recipe out of the all new Ball Book of Canning. I know, surprise, surprise, right? They have a great basic recipe in here, and I love the method that they use. For those of you who've never made French onion soup, to caramelize onions, you typically use some butter and some olive oil to caramelize your onions. Well, in canning, we have to be careful of the amount of fat we're adding, and certainly dairy is usually a big no-no. Most tested recipes that call for dairy, and tested is the key word here, please don't just trust anything you see on the internet. Dairy is really a no-no for canning, but some tested recipes do allow for it. And this is one recipe, but they're only allowing 1 tablespoon of butter. And typically you use more than that to caramelize your onions. So just a word of caution on that. We don't want to add any more fat. We don't want to add any more dairy. Please stick to the 1 tablespoon that's recommended in the this recipe by Ball. This is a tested recipe, so that really is important, you guys. So anyway, the method that they use is you melt your butter and then you add your onions and you add wine, and then you put the lid on your Dutch oven and let your onions cook for about an hour to tenderize. They're simmering in the wine, so they're getting all that delicious flavor, which is a little bit different method than making traditional French onion soup. Like I said, usually you use more butter, usually use olive oil or another fat, and that's too much fat for us to use for canning. So that's why we are going to stick with this recipe and be safe, and it works really well. So after your onions cook with the lid on for about an hour, you take the lid off and then let the wine evaporate, and then you can get them caramelized. We crank up the heat and we caramelize the onions, and then we add some beef stock, some more wine, and a few other seasonings. So it's a great method. It works really well, and it allows us to use a little bit of dairy in a recipe that is also safe for canning. So I do enjoy this recipe. Now, their recipe, I'm going to deviate just a little bit because you know me, I have to change it up just enough to make it my own, and I want to add a little more flavor to it. So I'm going to be adding some Worcestershire sauce and also a little bit of the kitchen Bouquet browning and seasoning sauce. This stuff is fantastic for adding flavor. And then a word on your stock. Their recipe calls for 3 quarts of beef bone broth, which is also a recipe that they show you how to do in this book. So you can use 3 quarts of all beef stock, or you can use a combination of beef and chicken stock. I really enjoy the combination of both the beef and chicken stock. I've made straight up French onion soup that way, and it really adds a complex flavor to it. So it's up to you if you want to do half and half, if you want to do all beef. Either way works really well. But I'm not going to be using traditional bone broth. I'm going to be using the Better Than Bouillon beef base. I love this stuff, you guys. If you do not have this as a staple in your kitchen, you need to. I use both the chicken and the beef all the time to add flavor to all kinds of dishes. But you can also just reconstitute it in some boiling water and have instant beef broth or chicken broth, whichever. And they do have vegetable also. So lots of options, but this stuff is fantastic. It has a ton of flavor to it, and I just love using it. So that's what I'm going to be using for my beef stock, and I think I'm going to throw in a quart of chicken stock to have that more complex flavor. But like I said, that's up to you. You do what works for you. So you need some dry white wine. I'm going to be using some Pinot Grigio. That is something that we enjoy drinking, so I use it in this recipe. You can use Chardonnay, you can use a dry Riesling, you can use whatever dry white wine you want. It just needs to be a dry wine. You don't want to use a sweet wine. And no worries about the alcohol, that all cooks away if you're not a wine drinker, but it lends tons of flavor, and you can't have French onion soup without a little bit of wine in the background. Some people use sherry. This recipe does not call for that, so I'm just going to be using wine. Most people have wine on hand anyway. Works well. And then you're going to need 4 pounds of onions. And I used about 6 of these bad boys. Costco had a great sale on a big bag of onions. So that's what I'm using. And trust me, you want to err on the having more side of things. I've made this recipe before. The onions cook down a ton. I know this looks like a lot of onions, but they will cook down. And it was almost too brothy when I was more conservative. So don't be too conservative with your onions. You really want that full 4 pounds of onions in your soup. So, and then we just need a few seasonings. We're going to use thyme. I'm going to use a bay leaf. That is not called for in the recipe, but I'm going to use some bay leaf. I love that flavor, and it's great in soups, and I know it's safe to add. And just some salt and pepper. Now, their recipe calls for 1 tablespoon of salt. I'm going to hold off on adding my salt until I put everything together, because the Better Than Bouillon beef base can be on the salty side, and so can the kitchen Bouquet. So I'm not going to add salt right off the bat. I am going to add pepper right off the bat, but I'm going to wait to season it with salt until we put it all together and taste it. Plus I salt my chicken stock as well, so I'm going to hold off on the salt and I'm going to taste it first. But the recipe does call for 1 tablespoon. So really it's just basic ingredients. The really important part is to have some delicious onions. You can use whatever onions you like. I like the large sweet onions. Some people use a combination of sweet, yellow, red, whatever you like is fine. Just use what appeals to you or whatever you have in your kitchen. But trust me, you are going to love this. So what we're going to do is we're going to get started. I'm going to move my book out of the way. We want to start our pan. And you can go ahead and just start it on high. We want to melt 1 tablespoon of butter, only 1 tablespoon. Okay guys, once your butter has melted, you want to add your onions. I did fail to mention that, and I apologize. You want to slice your onions in about 1/4 inch slices. I use my mandolin to do that, but you can do it by hand if you prefer. So we just want to go ahead and add all of our onions. And then to that, we're going to add 2 cups of our wine. We are going to add 1 teaspoon of thyme, dried thyme. You could use fresh thyme. I think dried thyme works a little bit better. Fresh herbs don't tend to hold up as well in a long cooking process. They can lose their flavor. So I'm going to use the dried but that's up to you. And you want about a teaspoon. This is to taste, so you could use a little more if you want to, but about a teaspoon is good. And then I'm going to use 1 bay leaf. You could use more than one if you want. I use the Spice Island bay leaves and they are pretty strong. So I am only going to use 1. And then, like I said, I'm going to hold off on the pepper, or on the salt, but I am going to add about 2 teaspoons of black pepper. So what we're going to do now is we're going to put the lid on. And we're going to let that come up to a nice simmer. I'm going to leave mine on a medium heat, and we're going to let that come up to a nice simmer. I will remove the lid every now and then to give everything a nice stir. But we want to let it cook like that for about an hour. We want our onions to get nice and soft and tender, and they'll smell delicious and all that. And then when we come back, we will add our stock and a few other seasonings and get our soup all ready, and then we'll also be ready for canning. So I'll bring you back. Okay guys, I wanted to bring you in close. We are about halfway through our cooking time, but I wanted you to see how much our onions have cooked down. See, it's almost by half of where we started. So you just want to keep it on a really nice simmer. You don't want to cook it too vigorously. We're just trying to get our onions to soften up a little bit. And you just want to give it a stir about every 10 minutes or so to make sure everything's cooking evenly. And I'm going to put the lid back on and let it hang out for another 30 minutes. Okay guys, my onions have been cooking for about an hour. Trust me on this, you do not want to go much past an hour. I have gone past an hour before thinking that they needed to cook longer, and like I said in my intro, they were almost mushed by the time I was done canning them. So an hour really is sufficient. They should start looking translucent and they should be really tender. That's what you're looking for. So now what we need to do, and this is another thing I learned, the canning book does not talk about this, but this is important, is you want to crank up your heat, because now we want to get some color on our onions. So it's important to crank up your heat. If you leave it turned down to a low simmer, it takes forever for them to caramelize. So we need the rest of the liquid to evaporate so that they can get some color on them. You want to stir them very frequently at this point. You do not want your onions to burn, but we do want some color. So that'll take a little bit, 10 minutes or so. So you want it pretty high, get the evaporation going, and we need to get some color going. And then I'll bring you back and we'll add our other ingredients. Okay guys, you can tell that most of my liquid has evaporated. At that point is when you really want to be careful and make sure that you stir it fairly frequently. Like I said, we don't want our onions to burn. So up to this point, it's taken about 8 minutes or so for me to get to this point. But you can tell that the liquid is mostly gone. And then, like I said, we're going to want to really keep an eye on this, because once they start changing color, they'll start to caramelize pretty quickly for us. So keep an eye on it, stir it every minute or so, make sure nothing's burning on the bottom, and just keep going till your onions are nice and caramelized. Okay, something that I did fail to mention, if you added your bay leaf, you're going to want to remove it at this point, get rid of it while your onions are caramelizing. Okay guys, our onions are starting to caramelize. You can tell that they're starting to get, if you move them around, you can see in your pan where that's starting to get dark. We want those brown bits on the bottom. But at this point, you really want to watch your onions because we don't want them to burn. So it's been about 20 minutes for all of my liquid to evaporate and for us to get to this point. To continue to caramelize them, it shouldn't take very long, just a few minutes. And then we can add our other ingredients. Okay guys, once your onions have turned a nice caramel flavor, we're ready to put our soup all together. I just wanted to say that you're going to want to stir, once they start to caramelize, you're going to want to stir them about every 30 seconds. You want them to come in contact with the pan enough time to get some color on them, but not so long they burn. So about every 30 seconds, you're going to want to give them a stir. So now what we need to do is you can just go ahead and leave your heat on high. We're going to add another cup of white wine. And we're going to scrape up all of the bits on the bottom of our pot, and we're going to let the wine cook with our onions for about a minute or so. Okay, so now we want to add our stock, and I'm going to use a combination of chicken and beef. So I'm going to add 1 quart of chicken stock. And I'm also going to add 2 quarts of the beef stock that I made from the Better Than Bouillon. So you need 3 cups total stock. And then for a little extra punch and seasoning, I'm going to add a couple of teaspoons or so of Worcestershire, and I'm also going to add a teaspoon or 2 of the kitchen Bouquet. The kitchen Bouquet will give your broth a beautiful color and a really intense flavor. Love it so much. The other thing that I'm going to add, just to bump up the flavor a little bit more, is I'm going to add about a half a teaspoon to a teaspoon of garlic powder. I love garlic and onion together, but that's totally optional, completely up to you. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this up to a simmer, and I'm going to let it simmer for 15 minutes. And while it simmers, I'm going to get my canner and my jars ready. Okay guys, we are all set for canning. My soup has simmered for about 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes. So it's all ready to go. Make sure you taste it. I did end up adding a little bit of salt, and I also wanted more thyme, and I added more of the kitchen Bouquet. So just taste it, adjust according to your taste, but the amounts that I originally gave you are a great place to start. So we're all ready to can. French onion soup is a low acid food, so it must be pressure canned. So I have about 3 inches, 2 to 3 inches of simmering water in the bottom of my canner with my rack. So it's ready to go. Modern canning guidelines state that you do not need to pre-sterilize lids and jars as long as you're canning for 10 minutes or more, and we're going to be. You can can in pints or quarts. I'm going to be canning in pints. If you can in pints, your time is going to be, your processing time will be 60 minutes. If you're canning in quarts, your processing time is going to be 1 hour and 15 minutes. We're looking for a 1-inch headspace, and this recipe should give us approximately 8 pints or 4 quart jars. So I went ahead and washed my lids, set those aside, and you want to make sure you have hot jars. Mine are hot in my sink. I keep mine hot with a sink full of hot water. So we are ready to get started. So let's get a couple of jars here. And then we're going to take our funnel. Sorry, I moved you a little bit, hoping you can see a little bit better. So we need our funnel, and we are looking, like I said, for a 1-inch headspace. Ladle your hot soup into your hot jar. And I left my onions kind of long. Okay, that's good. Usually at this point we would debubble, but since most of what we have is liquid, there's really no need. There's nothing to debubble. So we're going to go ahead and take a paper towel dipped in white vinegar to clean our rims. We're going to place our lid and then apply your bands fingertip tight. And then lift them into your canner. Okay guys, my canner is full. I have 8 pint jars in there ready to go. So now what we need to do is put our lid on. Oops. I have an All-American canner, and with the All-American canner you want to line up your arrow on the lid with the notch on the pot, and then we're going to tighten our thumb screws 2 at a time opposites. We're going to crank up our heat to high. Once we see steam pouring out of our vent here, we're going to let it vent for 10 minutes, and then we can add our weight, bring it up to pressure, and then we can start our processing time. Okay guys, hopefully you can see okay. I've got steam pouring out my vent, and that's been venting for 10 minutes. So now it's time to put on our weight. Now, to know what pounds of pressure you need to use, you need to know your altitude. I'm below 1,000 feet, so for me, it's 10 pounds of pressure, but make sure you check your altitude and know what adjustments that you need to make. So we're gonna go ahead and place our weight. Once our canner comes up to temperature and our weight starts rocking and rolling, then we can start timing. Okay guys, we're back. Our weight is rocking and rolling, so that means it's time to start timing. I'm canning in pint jars, so I need to process for 60 minutes. So I'm gonna set my timer for 60 minutes. The other thing that you need to know is we don't want it rocking and rolling this hard the whole time. So you need to adjust your weight so that you adjust your temperature, adjust your stove so that your weight rocks 1 to 3 times a minute. And you want to don't adjust it drastically, just reduce it slowly. You don't want a drastic temperature change in your canner. So just turn it down gently till it's rocking 1 to 3 times a minute. Process for 60 minutes and I'll bring you back. Okay guys, I have turned off my heat. Our time is up. I turned off my heat and I'm going to let my canner return to 0 pressure naturally. Once that happens, once you're back to 0 pressure, you can remove your weight, and then you're going to wait about 5 minutes, and then you can take the lid off of your canner, and then you're going to let your jars sit in your canner for at least 10 minutes to cool a little bit before we remove them. I did want to point out that I messed up. I've had a lot of comings and goings in my kitchen today and I got distracted. Usually, if you've watched any of my other videos, you've seen me take the vinegar that I clean the rims of my jars with. I pour that in my canner so that during the canning process, there are minerals in our water that like to collect on the jars during the canning process. If you use a couple of tablespoons of vinegar in your water, it doesn't do that. It keeps your jars nice and sparkly clean. So I failed to do that this time. I apologize, but typically I do that. So that film that collects on your jars can be kind of hard to remove after the fact. So we'll see what they look like when they come out. You can remove it, but it's a lot harder to do after the fact than it is to just put a couple tablespoons of vinegar in your canner. So anyway, after we wait the appropriate time, we can see our delicious soup. Okay guys, we are all done. I let my canner return to 0 pressure naturally. Then I removed the weight, waited my 5 minutes, took the lid off, and my jars have been sitting in my canner for about 15 minutes, but you only need to let them sit for 10. So we are ready to remove them and see our delicious soup. One of the benefits of this is it makes your house smell amazing. If you like onion, it smells so good. And like I said, this soup is so versatile. It is so great to have on your shelf. So comforting on a cold, rainy day like today is in Ohio. This is the perfect day to make this. Just delicious, one of my absolute favorites. Okay, there you go. Doesn't that look delicious? All those beautiful onions, the delicious broth, so yummy. So now all you need is to toast you up a little crouton from a baguette with some nice melty Gruyere cheese, and you have a delicious bowl of soup. But like I said, lots of ways to use it, so don't just eat it you don't have to eat it just straight from the jar. Tons of ways to use it, and I'm sure you'll come up with many that I didn't even think of. So thanks for joining me today, guys. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them for me in the comment section. I'm here to help you in any way I can on your canning journey, and I appreciate you also very much. I hope you are staying safe and well and making the best of these crazy times we're in. So have a great day, guys. Thanks for joining me, and I will see you next time. Just as a reminder, make sure to let your jars sit undisturbed for 12 to 24 hours. Then you can remove the bands, check your seals, make sure you wash your jars and then label them, and then you can store them in a cool, dark place.